So now that we heard a bit about why academia needs open science and why the industry could benefit from open science, we should probably stop for a minute, consider how do we best perform open science before we get ahead of ourselves. And now to elaborate on how to best conduct open science, we have with us today Dr. Courtney Soderberg from the Center for Open Science in Virginia, USA. Courtney, you earned your PhD in social psychology at UC Davis, and you're now employed at the Center for Open Science as a methodologist and a statistical consultant. And you're here today to tell us a little bit about how we can best and most efficient perform open science. We're very, very glad to have you here today. The floor is yours.
All right, good morning, everyone. Sorry, if at any point during this I start making absolutely no sense, just raise your hand and let me know. I'm very jet lagged at the moment, so we'll see how this goes. So good morning, as Asghar mentioned, my name is Courtney Soderberg. I work at the Center for Open Science now, but before that, I was a practicing scientist as a experimental social psychologist. So what I'm going to do today is tell you all a bit about kind of ideas around open science and reproducibility, how those go together, what we mean when we say openness, and what are all the different pieces and parts that go into that, and work together to make science more reproducible. And then talk about what some of the things that the Center for Open Science is doing to try and make that easier for researchers to engage in and give them more motivation to do that. So the Center for Open Science is a nonprofit technology company in the US. We've been around for about 4 years now. And the mission of the center is to increase the openness, integrity, and reproducibility of scholarly research. And so the center got started, as I mentioned, about 4 years ago. And there were many reasons it started, but one of the things that kind of kicked off a lot of talk about open science was actually fears about the reproducibility of different scientific disciplines. So in probably around 2007 to 2008, a lot of articles started coming out, both in the popular press and in the scholarly research, talking about low levels of reproducibility in many different scholarly fields, everything from pharmacology to cancer biology, neuroscience, psychology, chemistry, ecology. This seemed to be something that was pretty pervasive across a broad variety of scientific disciplines, and maybe the published literature wasn't as sound as we thought. And a lot of people started getting worried about this because the published literature is where we're supposed to go to kind of figure out what do we know. We look at that to build off of it for our next series of work. And so the question started becoming, well, why are there low levels of reproducibility? What is kind of leading to this? And because it was happening in so many different fields, that suggested that it wasn't just a couple of bad apples. It wasn't this wasn't fraud. There seemed to be something pervasive about the way we do and did science that was leading to these low levels of reproducibility. And so one of those central issues is that in most research disciplines, the incentives for me as an individual researcher, my success is about focusing on getting things published, not necessarily getting them right. Now, publication and correctness don't have to be opposed to one another, but the problem is that in many fields, certain types of research get published more than other types of research. So novel results tend to get published. If I find the new shiny thing, I'm much more likely to get published than if I do that really important, but not necessarily as novel, programmatic replication work to determine the soundness of that novel finding. Positive results, so results that are in line with what I thought I was going to get, that statistically significant result, are more likely to get published than negative or null results, so if I don't find what I thought I was going to find. And clean results are more likely to get published than mixed results. So I may have some really interesting research, I have some mixed findings for it, which may suggest that this is a little bit more complicated than I originally thought, but unfortunately that's less likely to get published than if I have a clean, beautiful set of studies. And so what that means is that I, as a researcher, am very, very motivated to find novel, positive, clean results. And this can set up a really kind of bizarre motivational structure that can have a really big impact on what gets published and therefore what we think we know. And I will talk about how this is related to openness in a minute, I promise. So, right, what is kind of driving these problems of reproducibility is that we tend to focus on this. What is the result? what does it say in my final report? But actually, scientific research is much longer than that, right? There are tons of steps that happen before I ever get to the published result. And that publication is kind of the best shiny version of the story I want to tell of my research. And so there's a lot of information that goes in here that is actually lost in that published report. It's not the most detailed description of what I did. It's kind of the best story of it. And so what we've begun to realize is that all these steps, the process of how I did the work, is really, really important to understanding what those results mean. So how does this relate to openness? Well, Simeon Vazir, who's a psychologist in the US, said, without transparency, assessing a study is like buying a used car without being able to look under the hood. Right? Openness is incredibly related to kind of this cycle, because being open is what allows me to better see what all those steps were that an individual researcher went through to get to that published report, and I can decide how much faith I want to put in those results if I know more about that whole process. Right, so if we think of scientific knowledge and knowledge building in science, it requires programmatic work. Rarely am I going to decide that something is definitely true based on one individual experiment by one individual in one lab. Reproducibility, if I take your data and your analysis scripts, can I get the same result? And replicability, can I redo your work and get the same result again? Are kind of the hallmarks of science. We want to be able to reproduce and replicate things. If I'm the only one who can ever get it, then it probably wasn't real to start out with. Or there may be some unknown third variable that's actually affecting the system I'm in. And so in order for me to do programmatic work that is reproducible and replicable, multiple individuals and groups are kind of required in this system. I have to be able to hand this off to somebody else, and they need to be able to pick that up and redo it. So what that means is that science is really about verification and building. In order to verify somebody else's work, or even my work, like from 6 months ago, which is basically the same as work done by a total and complete stranger, because, right, we're humans, our memories are good, but not quite that good, and we forget a lot of those little details, right? In order to verify somebody's work, I'm going to want to recheck their analysis scripts and their results. We are all humans, we make mistakes, and so that checking process is actually really important to verifying, do I really think that what they say is there is actually there? I may also want to do a different type of verification, sensitivity or robustness checks, so run slightly different models on the data, look at it with a slightly different set of assumptions, and see if I really kick the tires on it, am I coming to the same conclusion? When I'm thinking about building on work, this is going to set up a couple of different things that I want to do. So in order to build off work, I really want to know that I kind of have a good understanding of everything that's been done before. Not just what has been published, but all the research that's been going on in that area, unpublished or not. I'm also going to need to rerun protocols because I'm probably going to be reusing either that entire experiment or a part of it. And I may also want to modify and extend that work. So having those protocols, having that data set in a way that will allow me to change it. So, getting back to the whole point of this talk, openness. How does this relate to openness on the broad scale? Well, openness is going to allow us to do this more efficiently, right? There's a lot of handing off of information. And actually, how many of you have ever looked at a paper and tried to figure out exactly what was done in it and emailed the original author and gotten some sort of response of, everything you need to know is in the paper? Yeah. For any of you, was everything you needed to know actually in the paper? No, it's never all in the paper. And I have totally given that response to someone, and I now really regret that. We all think everything is in the paper. But the point is that a lot of this information isn't in there. It's not necessarily because we're purposefully leaving things out. It's that papers they have word limits. We leave stuff out. And so if we can be more open about all these different steps, it's easier to then hand this information off to the next person in the line or to ourselves in the future. So I think a lot of times when we talk about data or openness, people just think of data. They think of making the data open. But the point of this slide is, in order to really do this verification and building process, we want to think about openness on a much broader scale. For that verification, that's going to require at least open data and open code. I'm going to want to be able to look at the data. I'm going to want to be able to look at the code that produced the analyses. Ideally, I'd also have the protocol, but just like basic level, I need the data and the code. For that building part, to do studies that build off earlier ones, I'm going to need the protocol. So the protocol of how that original study was done needs to be open. I also probably want an open research plan. So what did they think they were going to do? What was the point of the study starting out, regardless of what they found? What was kind of their plan before they started? I'm also going to want open findings. And so this can be categorized kind of in two things. One, I want to be open about everything I found, whether that ended up getting published or not. And I also want access to those findings. So I don't work at a university anymore, which means that paywalls at journals are my nemesis right now. So with the closed, if the protocol is open and the research plan is open, but the actual findings are hidden behind a paywall, this can make it really difficult to make that work used by people who don't have the money or the connections to have access to those journal subscription policies. So the point is that really this scientific process, rather than just thinking about being open in the published report, we want to think about how we can open up this entire life cycle. Not just the data, not just the code, but the process of how that science was done. So why aren't people doing this right now? Right, I'm a psychologist. I care a lot about motivations and behavior. And so if we know why people aren't doing something, we can kind of figure out, okay, what are some changes we could make to the system to maybe make it more likely that people are going to engage in open research practices? So the first barrier to implementation is perceived norms. We know that people tend to follow the norms that they think are out there in the world. And in a lot of scientific disciplines, sharing is not the norm. Or it's not perceived to be the norm. And so I, as a researcher, if I don't think other people are being open, I'm less likely to be open in my own work. Another is a psychological concept called motivated reasoning. As humans, we don't actually interact and perceive the world in kind of a completely rational fashion. Hopefully this is not news to anyone. But if there's an economist in the audience, I'm sorry. So, right, the motivations we have can really change how we process information. We like to remember information, pay attention to information, interpret information in ways that fit with how we want to see the world. And so if we go into our research having either a hypothesis we really believe in or knowing that we need to get a certain result to please our PI or the journal we want to go to or something like that, that can really change how we interpret information. And the information that we are really good at as humans is kind of explaining away. And so that means that we can kind of misinterpret our own data really easily without realizing it. And kind of come up with really good, not excuses, but reasons why, oh, we can't show this, we can't show that. Because we may be very unmotivated to do that. Another one is minimal accountability. We're rarely required to do this stuff, and when we are required, rarely anyone checks on it, which relates to the final point. I am busy, right? As a researcher, you guys have way more stuff to do than you have time for. And so if all of a sudden I say you have to be like really good at research, you have to be really good at knowing your field of study, that's a chord, field of study, and oh, by the way, you now have to like learn about data management and sharing and licenses and repositories and cloud-based storage systems. Like, I've lost you 3 things ago because you're like, nope, don't have time, not gonna do this, no one cares. So, right, we really wanna be able, all of these are important, but we really wanna be able to work on 3 and 4. So how do we do that? So one of the things that the Center for Open Science does is we try and kind of approach the problem of openness and sharing from a couple of different bents at the same time, because this is a complicated problem, right? If I fix the fact that well, I'm not going to fix the fact that you're busy. You will always be busy. But if I can make it easier for somebody to implement open practices, but they still perceive the norms in their field to be that sharing doesn't happen, that's going to be a barrier to implementation. If I change the norms and I make it so it's easy to implement, but I don't give the researcher any incentive to do it, if they don't understand why it's going to help them, then, still there may be a barrier to implementation. So at the Center for Open Science, we try and combine creation of tools with work with the scholarly and journal community to change incentives, as well as training to try and make it so that researchers feel like they understand how to be open, that they have good reasons to be open, and also have the technological tools to make that not such a quite as a high bar to jump over. So I'm kind of going to talk about the 3 areas that the center works in. So the first is technology to enable change. So the center, about half of my coworkers are developers. And one of the tools we build is something called the Open Science Framework, or OSF for short. The OSF is a completely free and open source web tool that was designed to help researchers collaboratively document, manage, and if they want to, share that entire research lifecycle. It can be used to just share data or just share code, but the hope is that it makes it easier for researchers to document what they're doing from the beginning, so that if they want to then go and share that research process or that data or that code, they're not trying to frantically make it all open at the beginning of their project and back document everything they've been doing for the last 6 months, because that is something that is just way more painful than it should be. So how can we make this easy to start early, document as we go, and therefore make it really simple when we decide to share? So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the system, I know that the open science students are using it, and every time anyone at my office sees their projects, they go, oh, they're so nicely set up. So major pluses to you all for that. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with the system, it can do a couple of things. It allows you to put kind of all the inputs and outputs of the research in the same place. So it's not just for data or just for code or just for protocols. You can put the data, the code, the protocols, the article in one place. So it's easier to get that full picture of how the research was done. It also allows you to manage access and permissions. So people who you need to collaborate with can get access to the project when they need access, and you can give them exactly as much access as you want them to have. So it allows you to basically lock some files so that people couldn't go in and change them, like data files. You may not want anyone to be able to change those once they come in. But what this also allows you to do is get a really good handle on exactly who am I sharing this with at what stage of the process. So if, for example, I was submitting to a journal that allowed open data, but only 3 months after the article was published, I could be using the system, keep it closed, but only open to the 3 other researchers I'm collaborating with, maybe my industry partner, my professor, and my other student collaborator. They would be able to get access to all the files, but they wouldn't be fully open yet. Automated versioning is also built into the system, and so that's about tracking that process. So as my protocol changes over time, maybe as I get into the lab and I start realizing that I have to make slight modifications, I can automatically version those and track them over time, so that I can always go and look back and see, okay, how has my protocol changed, or how has the kind of explanation of my results changed over time? And then it also allows researchers to connect the tools that they're already using. So one big thing with openness is, we want to make it as easy as possible. And so if a researcher already has some tools that they like for part of this process, it would make no sense to say stop using those and use other ones. But because we want to be able to open this whole process up, rather than telling somebody to go to 5 different places to find the data and the code and the protocol and the preprints, if we can give somebody one link to one site, it makes it easier to understand that whole research ecosystem of the process. So in one project, I can connect a GitHub repository that maybe houses my code, an Amazon Web Service account that maybe houses a very large data set that I have, and put some files on the OSF if I want to. So here are the programs that we currently connect to, and here are the ones that are going to be connected in the coming months. And then the last two things I'll mention about it is you'll notice there's this public-private button at the top. What that means is that I have the choice about what I share and when I share. As much as I love open science, not everything is something that I'm going to be allowed to share. There may be ethical reasons why I'm not allowed to share stuff, right? I work with human subjects data. Not all human subjects data can be made publicly available. Or perhaps I'm working with a group and I got the data through a very specific data sharing agreement, and they say, you can use the data, no one else can. However, you can open up the protocol and the analysis scripts around that. So what I can do is use the project in a private manner, and then at any point I want to, just click one button and make either the entire project or part of it public. So making that sharing step very easy. When I want to share, I don't have to move everything over, I don't have to redocument things. I can share with a simple click of the button. And once that is shared, everything on the site has persistent identifiers. So I can create citations around that information, so I can get credit for the work that I am making openly available. I can also append licenses to it so that people know how they're allowed to reuse that work. So I don't just have to be open for kind of the good of science, I can also be open and get citations for that, for my data and for my code. And finally, if I want to pull in that last step, that making the research article open, there are two ways I could do that. One is to publish in an open access journal. And for some types of research, that can be a great option. Other times, maybe the journal that I really want to publish in is a closed access journal. You know, sometimes that's just what I need for my CV at the moment, or really that might be the best place for that article, and that's completely fine. I can think about what are ways that I can be open but still publish in the journal I want to. And one way to do that is through something called a preprint or a postprint. So it's not in the slides, but I was talking with Iben this morning, and she was asking about a couple of different journals and whether they allow you to post a preprint or a postprint. So for those of you who don't know, a postprint is just, once it's been published in a journal, posting the non-copy edited manuscript copy to a repository or personal website. And if you ever want to know this, there's a website called Sherpa Romeo. If you just Google it, it should be the first thing that comes up, and you can put in a journal name and it will tell you the exact preprint and postprint policies of those journals. And so what this means is you can still choose the journal you want to publish in, but give more people access to the findings of that through posting preprints and postprints. And so you can do that actually directly on the OSF. It's a different layer on top of the system, but what it does on the back end is create an OSF project. So the data and the code can live exactly where the postprint lives for that specific article. And we're working with a variety of different societies and groups to create preprint servers for particular types of research. So Ag Archive is agricultural, Eng Archive, I think we decided that's how you pronounce that, is engineering, Sci Archive is obviously psychology, so forth and so on. So that's the technology we're working on, but technology doesn't really matter if nobody knows how to use it or nobody knows kind of what openness is and what to do with it. So another thing we work on is training to make researchers feel that they actually can enact this change. So we do training through a couple of different ways. We have live webinars, a couple every month on various topics related to openness and reproducibility. And we also record those, and they're always posted on our YouTube channel. We also do small group consults. So if researchers kind of understand, I know generally how openness works, but I'm unclear what is the best way to do it for this particular research project or my particular research group given these various constraints. We also do online small group consults around that to try and give researchers the tools they need to do it in their own research, because that translation between abstract concepts and concrete implementation can sometimes be the trickiest part of that. And I put up the email for our training services as well as the link. And just like everything else we do, all of this is free. And then the final thing I mentioned is trying to work with the broader community around incentives to embrace change. So even if we make this easy, even if we help you understand what it is and how to do it, it's always good to have some sort of external motivation to do something rather than just, out of your internal belief system. So what are some of those? So I'm going to talk about two things very quickly. One is a program we're working on with a couple of different journals called badges. So the idea is, how do researchers signal to other people that they're actually engaging in these open and reproducible practices? And so there are 3 badges: open data, open materials, and pre-registration, which we didn't talk about, but it's basically just, did I tell you my research plan before I started? And how these work is, they're awarded by journals. One of them is psychological science, and they're awarded for researchers who choose to engage in these behaviors. So they're not required, but if I choose to open up my data, I can get a badge for it. And many of you in the audience might be saying, why in the world would I want one of these? It's a little, right? Like, it's a little picture. There is no money. Like, how is this motivating? Does anyone have any of those apps on their phones that the gamification ones where you get badges for doing tasks and other people can see the badges? Yeah? Are you more likely to do stuff because of it? So whether you think the answer is no or yes, seems to be that the answer is a yes. So what this is it's showing the amount of data sharing in psychological science is the dark one. And the gray ones are other journals, comparable journals in psychology that did not implement badges. And this little red line is when psych science started awarding badges. And the y-axis is the percentage of articles that made data available. And so what you'll notice is that psych science has this big ramp up in data sharing from around, I think it was like 3%, nearly up to 40%. And you really don't see any sort of comparable increase in the other journals, which suggests that either badges were probably having effect, or there's something very specific about psych science after 2014 other than badges that was going on. Right, it's not a randomized controlled trial, so I'm not going to make really strong claims about causation, but the timing in the comparison group does suggest that allowing people to get recognition, and very public recognition, for open science practices does seems to help the implementation of those practices. It's also nice because what happens is these badges appear on the article. So the PDF, the hard copy, and the electronic copy. So it signals to other people that I'm engaging in this behavior, but it also makes it really clear for me as a reader what articles are sharing their data. So if I'm looking for an article because I want to build off their data set, it's really easy for me to scan down. It's really easy for me to understand, okay, who's engaging in these practices that I think are important for moving science forward. So the other thing that we're working on is something called the Transparency and Openness Practices Guidelines, or TOP for short. So far they've been adopted by a little under 30,000 journals, 3,000 journals, not 30,000, 3,000, and 69 organizations. So what the TOP guidelines are is they're guidelines around 8 different topics related to openness and transparency. So some of them are data related, like data citation, data transparency. Others are related to sharing of materials, the openness of the journal to publishing replication work. And each of them have 3 different levels. There's a disclosure statement, so just, for example, with data sharing, are you going to share your data, yes or no? There's a requirement step, you are required to share your data. And then there's a verification step. You're required to share your data, and someone actually checks that it's the right data, and it's where you said it was. And so the hope is that this is basically setting out a roadmap for journals, so they can figure out, okay, where am I on these top guidelines? And then where do I want to be? So the initial phase of the project was setting up these guidelines, and those 2,900 journals are journals that have signed the top guidelines. And what that means is they say they agree with the general principle, and will kind of look at their policies and decide if they want to change anything. We're now moving into phase 2, the implementation phase, so trying to nudge people more up those guidelines. So for example, Science magazine, which is part of AAAS, just recently decided, based on the top guidelines, to change some of their journal requirements to make it so that they met at least step 1, that's disclosure step, for all 8 of the categories. And for 4 of those categories, mainly related to data and materials transparency, they would actually be at step 2, so that requirement. So by laying out kind of a map for journals to follow, the hope is that the journal policies will change to promote more openness, and that will actually give researchers more of a motivation to engage in these practices, because now if I want to publish in science, I have to share my data. So I wanted to leave time for questions, but hopefully you've gained a little bit of knowledge about kind of all the different ways to be open, some tools out there that can help, and kind of a better understanding about openness is really about this whole process. Data sharing is a great first step. You know, if you have started to share your data, don't feel like that's not enough, because it is a fantastic first step and is more than a lot of people are doing right now. But if you've gotten to that step, try and take another step further. Share that code. Think about sharing that protocol or that process, so that eventually we can all get to sharing this full cycle, because that is what will really accelerate that verification and building that is so important to the scientific process. All right, thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions, so if anybody has a question, please shoot.
Yeah.
So when you show this dramatic increase in the number of people adopting the, what was science?
Psychological science, yeah.
Do you have any, what do you think that the motivational structure was? I mean, I could imagine altruistic, just I want to show this, but I could also be sort of showing it off to potential reviewers and speculations about what the guidelines were, etc. So how
Yeah. That's a great question. And we don't actually, I can speculate on the motivations. We don't actually know, because we didn't go and survey any of those researchers and ask them, hey, why did you suddenly start sharing your data when you didn't used to? So it's probably a couple of things. One is a long-term one, which is, so if I share my data, but I don't have a badge on my paper, then it's really hard for anyone else to see that I'm sharing my data unless I really go in and read the paper. And so I may think that very few people in my field are sharing anything, because it's hard for me to perceive. Once people start getting badges, it's really easy for me to see how many people in my field are sharing, which can change my perceptions of the norm in the field. And we know from social psychology that people tend to follow the norms they think are in place. So if I think more people are sharing, I am more likely to share. So that's probably some of what is driving the continued increase in data sharing we see. For the beginning part of it, I think part of it was probably driven by a want to show that I was engaging in a practice that a lot of people thought was a good thing. And now I can get a token for that. And people are surprisingly motivated by meaningless tokens. No, I'm serious. In a lot of psychology studies, we will tell, if we want undergrads to be really motivated, we'll say, hey, you're getting points for this. The points mean nothing and you cannot do anything with them, and they will still try harder. So I think a big part of it is a signaling mechanism, but some of it is also we as people like tokens. Yeah. Yeah.
Undskyld, kan vi lige tage mikrofonen over?
So with your very nice platform, you actually see that it results in accelerated innovation. Do people build on other people's projects?
That is a really great question. So it's a little hard to answer just because science has such a long tail to it. And the platform's only been around, I say only been around for 4 years. It was taken up initially mostly by in the psychology field. Now we have a much broader user base in many different fields. But I point that out because human subjects research can have a pretty long tail from start to finish, maybe like 1 to 2 years. And so there hasn't been a ton of cycles to go through yet. So we haven't been able to do yet a really kind of good investigation of, and no one has that I know of, if you make things open, does it accelerate the process? Because finding a control group to that is a little bit complicated. But I will say anecdotally, so one of the projects that we did at the center was something called the Reproducibility Project in Psychology, where we actually went and we recollected data on 100 psychology experiments to see what the replication rate was. That study was published in 2015. The data set was made available as well as all the protocols and everything. And I think between 2015 and now, I know of 7 different articles that have been published using that data set to kind of make new claims about, what was driving those rates of replicability, what might predict it, and kind of moving that meta-science field forward. So it's anecdotal evidence, but I hope that in the coming years, we and others in the field will be able to do kind of better research around that. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
I have a quick question. It's about the second to last slide. Yeah, exactly there. That they require to share their data. I was thinking that if you don't verify that they actually share their data, isn't it merely symbolic in the end?
Yeah, so verify normally means that you verify that it's the data they said it was. So normally in requirement, you hand over a link and somebody will just at least check that the link works. But they won't actually go in and say, okay, are all the variables that should be there? Is it in a usable format? Something like that. And you're right that if you require it but don't verify it, you aren't going to get perfect data. I think somebody's done a study and they found maybe and this was a couple years ago in journals that had started data requirements earlier. I think they found that about 30% of the data sets weren't quite perfectly reusable. So they failed that verification step in some way. So verification is definitely the ideal, but verification requires a lot more manpower. And so when journals are thinking about what is a step above what I normally do to take, the idea of hiring more people or giving the people they have more of a load to do that verification step is a really big ask for them, whereas this require step is less of an ask. And so just as researchers, we try and nudge them to take one step at a time. Same with journals. Get them to do the requirement step, and then once everyone kind of gets used to that, then say, hey, maybe you want to go one step further. Yeah, it's a great question, though.
I think that's all the question we have time for right now. So let's thank Courtney once again for being here.
Thank you.
And as compensation for jet lag, we have a little something for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today, Courtney.
Thanks.